try. Okay.
Okay. All right. We're still waiting for a couple more students as we wait for those to file in. Let me know if you have questions, something on your mind, maybe something we mentioned last week. Perhaps here's something about the optional readings you've been doing on the side. Okay. Well, if not, we're going to turn our attention to our main topic. And as I was explaining earlier, we'll be doing another class worth of lecture, if you will. So starting next week, we will be starting with some hands-on practices. So this means that for this week, you don't have to do any weekly assignment as well, right? You don't have any report to turn in or to write as of yet. 1 second here. Right. So first, I want to say something about the primary text we will be using for our purpose, the so-called Anapanasati Sutta, which is typically translated as the discourse on mindfulness of inhalation and exhalation, right? In and out breathing, something to that effect. And a little bit of technical background information. This text is part of what people refer to as the early Buddhist texts. Okay, so by early Buddhist texts, people usually mean to differentiate them from the so-called Mahayana texts. So virtually all the Mahayana texts were written um, at the earliest 400 years after the Buddha's passing. Okay, and they really represent a different genre, if you will, with distinct doctrinal ethos, with notable elements are quite distinct from what you can see in the so-called early Buddhist texts. And the early Buddhist texts are the ones that are the oldest extant discourses we have available, most of which are traceable to about 1.5 century after the Buddha's passing, and they're preserved by monks and nuns, mostly via so-called oral transmission. So this was prior to the invention of writing as a technology. And so virtually all the suttas that were compiled before the beginning of the Common Era, they were transmitted in such a way. And this particular sutta or discourse or sermon by the Buddha is preserved in quite a number of different Buddhist canons. So, for example, in the Pali canon, this is the Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 118. And in the Chinese canon, this belongs to the so-called Ekottara Agama or Zhengya Hanjing. And why do we select this particular text as our primary text? Because among the early Buddhist discourses, this contains the most detailed meditation instruction encompassing the entire meditative path. And I do want to show you at least portions of the text that will be discussed with greatest details in this class. So here we are. This is part of the Anapanasati Sutta I'm quoting. Now, how is mindfulness of in and out breathing developed and pursued so as to be of great fruit, of great benefit? Those of you who are not familiar with these coded Buddhist terms, okay, when you come across a great fruit, great benefit, right? The Mahapala in Pali and Chinese 大果,大福利, right? This usually refers to something called the supramundane fruition, the supramundane attainments. The early texts usually describe them as consisting of 4 stages. So you would have the so-called first fruition, second fruition, third fruition, fourth fruition. The fourth being the highest religious attainment in early Buddhism, namely arahahood, right? Or the stage where all mental defilements, every form of suffering is completely eradicated. Continuing, there is the case where a monk, having gone to the wilderness, sometimes translated as forest, to the shade of a tree or to an empty building, sits down folding his legs crosswise, holding his body erect, and setting mindfulness to the fore. Always mindful, he breathes in. Mindful, he breathes out. Okay, so there are quite a few things that are of note. In early Buddhist teachings, meditation is typically carried out in solitude. This doesn't mean that you have to permanently relocate to a mountain cave or to shun human company altogether, right? But this does mean that for the short durations, in the moments when you are immersing yourself in meditative practice, it is considered a good idea to temporarily withdraw yourself from human contact. Psychologically, this has a lot to do with the fact that when we're interacting with people, we're primarily in what is called the social mode, right? We're concerned about proper ways to conduct ourselves, to comply with social norms, protocols, not offending other people, putting on different sort of persona or even masks, right, in order to project ourselves different ways. We oftentimes engage in social interactions with certain agendas in mind. And all these endeavors, all these subtle activities, they really pose quite formidable impediments to your being able to really immerse in um, the task of knowing your mind intimately and transforming it. Right? The other thing is that, this is among the hundreds of early suttas that actually talked about physical posture, all right, the formal physical posture in which meditation is undertaken. However, despite the fact that in popular forms of Buddhism, you might have come across something called a half lotus sitting, right? Full lotus sitting. It's really, these very formal yoga asana, yoga posture, right? Where you, um, like put yourself in a sitting posture that is understood to incur some type of karmic merit, right? But as far as archaeologists are concerned, right, as far as people who study early Buddhism is concerned, half lotus and full lotus are most likely not used in this ancient period. Okay, so when we say uh, folding his legs crosswise, we're really talking about the so-called Indian sit. And then what about this expression, setting mindfulness to the fore? Now, by the way, this is going to become pretty big uh, in this class. The distinction between the scriptural tradition and the commentarial tradition. Okay. So what do I mean by this? So on the one hand, you have the suttas themselves, you have the discourses themselves, the sermons, right? They contain very old teachings. On the other hand, Buddhism has given rise to a very robust and extensive commentarial tradition. People write commentaries on the suttas explaining what they mean. And the commentaries, they came much later. Now, some commentaries have risen to such a status of prominence. They rival the suttas in terms of authoritativeness, right? That in itself is not necessarily a problem, but the problem lies in that, well, a potential problem lies in that the commentaries contain oftentimes ideas that one can argue to be very different than the ones you find in suttas. Okay, and this is not really a big surprise. As I pointed out, the time gap between any sutta and any commentary is oftentimes a 3 centuries, 5 centuries, if not more, apart from each other. And in that time gap, what we have seen is oftentimes like complete changes in the fate to the Buddhist institution. And so the commentaries oftentimes replaced a viable living community. So, in other words, the commentary is oftentimes used when entire living meditator communities have been wiped out in history due to, political persecution and various other historical reasons. And the commentators oftentimes have to work in a vacuum, so to speak, to reinvent Buddhism. In the process, they oftentimes will incorporate patently non-Buddhist elements, patently non-Buddhist ideas, ideas borrowed from non-Buddhist religions, for example, or ideas are really, like stemming from very liberal personal interpretation. And in the commentarial tradition, when it comes to this expression, right, this particular expression right here, setting mindfulness to the fore, is typically understood to mean placing your gaze at the tip of your nose or fixing your attention at the tip of your nose, right? So in the commentarial tradition, Buddhist meditation, the so-called shamatha training, the so-called calm training, the so-called concentration training, is understood to involve your fixing your attention to a single spot, maybe at the nose tip, maybe at your navel, maybe between your eyes, maybe at an external picture, maybe at an internalized picture, maybe at the sound of a magical syllable like a mantra, like a Buddha name, right? And so on and so forth. And interestingly, none of these meditation techniques could be found in early Buddhist texts. So in the early Buddhist suttas, the meditation is never about single pointedness. Is never about, say, for example, counting your breath. Is never about fusing your attention to the navel area until you've gotten rid of all distractiveness, right? Wandering thoughts and so forth, right? Early Buddhist meditation is never about that, as we will quickly see, okay? And so now, I am not therefore suggesting that, oh, if you practice according to the commentarial tradition, it is necessarily wrong or bad or, something that we actively discourage. No, I am merely acting once again as faithful a reporter as I can, right, to share with you the meaningful differences that I have observed. They may very well lead to different styles of practices and even with regard to that, we can withhold judgment, right? So, I could simply tell you that the commentary tradition and the scriptural tradition, the Sutanta traditions, are quite different, right? And without passing judgment that, therefore, one is superior to the other, right? Therefore, one is correct, the other is wrong, or anything to that effect. Okay, now coming back to this expression, setting mindfulness to the fore. What does it mean in the context of early sutta? Um, those of you who are interested in the academic, in the historical aspect of this, you're welcome to take my seminar on Buddhist meditation class, in which we really delve into, the linguistics, the semantics, the philology of expressions and so forth. But here, suffice it to say that this means something like bringing your attention to the task at hand. So, for example, let's say you are driving at this moment. How would you set your mindfulness to the fore? You will bring mindfulness to the task of driving. Now, the task of driving does not involve fixing your attention to a one point, right? It really involves a range of activity, such as you're being mindful of your speed, right? The speed at which your car is moving, right? You're being mindful of traffic signs around you. You're being mindful of whether or not there are pedestrians in the vicinity, how far away you are from the cars in front of you, lest you are tailgating, and so on and so forth, or even things like, um, when you're driving, whether or not you are tensing up your neck muscle or your shoulder muscle, uh, as to leading to unnecessary fatigue in the body. So setting mindfulness to the fore is like that. You are really bringing a sort of situational awareness, the appropriate type of heedfulness uh, to the main task at hand. And with regard to this main task, there are requisite activities you have to be simultaneously aware of and managing. Okay, now moving on to the part of the sutta that actually talks about the specific techniques. And there are 16 in total. Okay. So here we're dealing with the first group. By the way, the 16 steps, they are grouped in groups of four in Anapanasati, right? Each of which is called a tetrad, each of which corresponds to one of the four main satipatthana practices, the practice of establishing mindfulness, the foundations of mindfulness, depending on how you want to translate the word satipatthana. So steps one, two, three, four belongs to the first group, right? Five, six, seven, eight belongs to the second group, right? And so on and so forth. The first group of four correspond to something called the body-based satipatthana, right? The second group of four belongs to the feeling-based satipatthana. The third group of four belongs to what is known as the mind-based satipatthana. And the final group of four is traditionally called the Dhamma-based or the Dharma-based satipatthana. So here we are looking at the first group of four. They are, I'm quoting, number one, breathing in long, the meditator discerns, I'm breathing in long. Breathing out long, it discerns, I'm breathing out long. Or breathing in short, it discerns, I'm breathing in short. Breathing out short, he discerns, I'm breathing out short. Three, he trains himself. And by the way, this is the interesting part. Starting with step number three, the preface changed to he trains himself. Okay, this is the same from 3 all the way to 16. This formulaic opening is not there for step number 1 and 2, the reasoning for which we will discuss later. So he trains himself. I will breathe in, sensitive to, sometimes translated as aware of the entire body. He trains himself. I'll breathe out, sensitive to the entire body. Number 4, he trains himself. I'll breathe in, calming bodily sankharas, sometimes translated as fabrication, formation, activities, so on and so forth. He trains himself, I'll breathe out, calming bodily sankharas, right? So don't worry if you don't understand much of this. Okay, if you're utterly confused as with regards to what the sutta is saying, don't worry about it now. I just want to give you a preliminary impression. Moving on to the second group of four. Okay. Here we have step number 5. He trains himself. I will breathe in, sensitive to happiness, right? Or piti. He trains himself. I will breathe out, sensitive to happiness. He trains himself. I will breathe in, sensitive to pleasure, to sukha. He trains himself, I'll breathe out, sensitive to pleasure. Step 7, he trains himself, I will breathe in sensitive to mental sankhara, mental formation, volitional formations, mental activities. There are dozens of translations for this very tricky term. He trains himself, I'll breathe out sensitive to mental sankharas. He trains himself, I will breathe in calming mental sankharas. He trains himself, I will breathe out calming mental sankharas. Then moving on to the third group of 4, which is usually classified as the mind-based satipatthana. Step 9, he trains himself, I will breathe in sensitive to the mind, sometimes translated as being aware of the mind. He trains himself, I will breathe out, being aware of the mind. Number 10, he trains himself, I'll breathe in satisfying the mind, sometimes translated as gladdening, inspiring, elating, lifting, and so on and so forth. He trains himself, I will breathe out, satisfying, gladdening the mind. Number 11, he trains himself, I will breathe in, steadying the mind. Sometimes translated as composing. Sometimes people translate this as concentrating the mind, which I personally don't like because, as we will see, the word concentration is a little misleading when it comes to early Buddhist meditation. Number 12, he trains himself, I will breathe in, releasing the mind. He trains himself, I'll breathe out, releasing the mind. Now, moving on to the final group of 4, which is called the Dharma-based or the Dhamma-based Satipatthana, depending on whether you go with Sanskrit or Pali, respectively. Number 13, he trains himself, I will breathe in, focusing on impermanence or inconstancy. He trains himself, I will breathe out, focusing on impermanence, on inconstancy. Number 14, he trains himself, I will breathe in, focusing on dispassion, right? Viraga. Right? He trains himself, I will breathe out, focusing on dispassion. Number 15, he trains himself, I will breathe in, focusing on cessation, nirada. He trains himself, I will breathe out, focusing on cessation. Number 16, the final step, he trains himself, I will breathe in, focusing on relinquishment, sometimes translated as letting go. He trains himself, I will breathe out, focusing on letting go. Okay, so there you have it. Now, I haven't really shown you the entire sutta, but what I've shown you is the preface part, meaning the part of the sutta that deals with the setting up of meditation practice, and also the part of the sutta that actually gives an overview of the so-called 16 steps. And so here, I wanted to pause for a minute and ask for your input. You've briefly looked at the so-called 16 steps. And by the way, they're quite representative of the sort of style of meditation practice found in early Buddhism in general, found in the agamas and the nikayas in general. What is your impression of them? How do they differ from, say, the sort of meditation you are familiar with? Like to give you an example, okay. If you go to a typical meditation retreat nowadays, right? You go to a retreat that advertises itself as being concentration focused or an insight focused, right? Vipassana focused. what do you expect to find there? What sort of things are you typically expected to do? Anyone who's been to, I don't know, like a retreat done in the Goenka tradition, retreat done in the Pa'ak tradition, retreat done in the Mahasi tradition, retreat done by, like a Ajahn Chah affiliated temple, and so on and so forth. Anyone? And how is the kind of meditation people practice um, in present day different than the presentation, this overview that you just come across? Any thoughts? Any ideas? Any observations? Okay, how about let me start. Okay. When you go to a um, meditation retreat, and let's say you're beginning to experience happiness and pleasure, right? Wow, the first 3 days were very tough. Now the mind is like calmed down and I'm feeling happy and I'm experiencing these very weird but very pleasurable sensations in the body. And you go to the teacher. What would the teacher tell you typically? Any suggestions?
Don't get too attached.
Exactly. Very good. Exactly. The teacher will kind of evince a sort of attitude uh, where um, pleasure and happiness are treated kind of like a sort of taboo, right? So they will really go out of the way to make sure that um, you don't stay with the happiness and pleasure, right? You want to move on to what? To present moment awareness, for example, right? You want to um, you know, go straightforwardly to just being the present and just being mindfully aware of what is happening, right? Don't touch happiness, don't touch pleasure. Why? Because they are corrupting, right? Perhaps because they're addictive, because they're intoxicating, because they're distracting, and so on and so on. They have very little to do with real meditation. That's a general attitude. Now, however, when you read the early suttas, you will frequently come across the Buddhist advice on training yourself in happiness, training yourself in pleasure, right? How do you train in these things? Well, in the Buddhist assessment, happiness and pleasure are kind of like muscles. You can condition the way you relate to these experiences as to lead to the effect of maximizing these experiences, right? So you will come across meditation instructions such as deliberately gladden your mind, deliberately increase happiness, right? Deliberately bask yourself in pleasure, deliberately saturate your being with pleasure, right? The Buddha will teach instructions such as learn to recognize happiness and pleasure, learn to develop confidence in these types of pleasurable experiences in contrast to worldly ones, right? You will come across, sutta passages. The following sutta passage you will find in literally hundreds of early suttas, and that is, how do you go into a meditative state, a jhana, a dhyana, a channa, right? 初禅, 二禅, 三禅, 四禅. How do you go into it? First, you gladden your mind. As a result of your mind being gladdened or inspired, your body relaxes. As a result of your body becoming relaxed, it experiences pleasure. It experiences satisfaction. As a result of your body experiencing satisfaction, it calms down. As a result of the body calming down, the mind calms down, right? And that's the sequence of the practice. So not only is happiness and pleasure not shunned away in early Buddhist texts, they're actively being cultivated. So it would be one of the things we can say. Any other thoughts, other observations that you noticed? Difference between, this presentation and, maybe what you know about what you
I have a
experienced?
question.
Yes, please, by all means, Sarah.
how do you differentiate gladdening the mind to like an attachment to the
That's a
feelings?
very good question. That's a very, very good question. Right, right. And it's a complicated one, and I'm hoping that by the end of the semester you will have a very good idea, right? But for the present purpose, let me give you a rather preliminary introduction to the idea. So at the end of the practice, yes, eventually letting go is the goal, right? Which is suggested by the fact that the 16th step is letting go. And at the level of nirvana, at the level of nibbana, right? At the level of ultimate liberation, the mind has completely quenched its thirst, and therefore it no longer needs to feed, right? Before that, the mind is infested with a primordial and insatiable thirst, so to speak, which the Buddha called craving, right? Tanha. And so before the experience of Nibbana, the mind could not help but to always look for something to feed on. Now, you could try to tell your mind, no, right? Stop doing that. But you'll end up repressing it in futility, right? It will not help. The mind will almost spontaneously go to a place of pleasure. I'd say that right now, as you're listening to my talk and you find this talk utterly dry and boring and meaningless to you, right? What will your mind do? Your mind will concoct something, will create like a movie, and you will lose yourself in that daydream easily, right? Or like something happening in the background, and you'll immediately divert your attention to this other thing. As soon as it diverts attention to this object, and the mind realizes that it's not getting enough nutriment, enough um, entertainment from this new object, it will move on like a monkey, right? Always trying to. And then once it finds something fascinating and satisfying and gratifying and pleasurable, it will dwell there for a short while, right? And depending on how intense the pleasure is, the mind may fluctuate and wobble around, not really stably going into the pleasure, right? It's still kind of like if you like, maybe he's my boyfriend, maybe she's my girlfriend, but maybe not. I'm looking for someone better. I'm always on the lookout, right? But then if it's intense, it's satisfying enough, then the mind becomes entranced and stays there for a while until the entertainment value exhausts itself. Then the mind moves on again, right? So what you do in meditation is you train yourself so that your mind can abide in something that is more pleasurable than, say, sensual pleasure. And when you initially do this, right, you may have something that's just slightly superior, something that's just a little more satisfying than sensual pleasure. And so it's very easy for the mind to fall back or to feel precariously tempted by the inferior pleasure, right? Now, once you've mastered this level, what do you want to do? You don't want to get stuck there. You want to keep going into this experience, saturating yourself with this kind of happiness until you're so well fed, and then you are able to put yourself in a position to see the drawbacks, the limitation, the unsatisfactory nature of this new state, right? And then that's replaced by something still higher. Right? You keep doing this. You keep doing this. You keep doing this, right? And you're moving up the ladder. And this in early Buddhism is called the gradual training. It's called the gradual pacification of sankharas, right? And then as you're ascending this ladder, the goal is not simply to, increase your pleasure indefinitely. No. But in the process, you will sooner or later come to see that whatever amount of happiness you are able to procure and to feed on by using intention, it is not stable. It is not satisfying in the ultimate sense, right? It is wobbly. and so forth. And this will directly influence you as to become more willing to surrender your intention. Okay. And this will eventually lead to the so-called resolution of sankhara, where you no longer identify with sankhara, with intention, where you see that however great a pleasure you have at your disposal, so long that there is a feeding activity, there is some suffering. It's not good enough. Yeah. So gladdening is a sort of measure, right? In the sutta, it oftentimes talked about how, okay, first gladden your mind, right? And then after a while, you start feeling it's tiring to gladden your mind. In other words, you are um, beginning to recognize the stressful, the dukkha nature of doing something, right? And so you let that go. And you feel, hey, you know what? Even without the gladness of the mind, I'm okay when the body is content, right? And then you move, and then, like after a while, you go, ah, even without physical contentment, I'm okay when there's imperturbability, when there's non-fashioning. Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry. I saw a hand, by the way. And by the way, feel free to just chime in, unmute yourself, just interrupt me anytime. Yes, Albert.
Hi, Professor. Yeah, same thing that I said earlier. Like the last week or two, I've been doing a guided meditation with Anapana. And like in the second tetrad, it's like step 5 and 6. It feels really uncomfortable for me because I'm like a open awareness kind of a practitioner, but I'm in this class and I'm curious. And I started off kind of, in that sense, and I've been really open and expansive. So it's definitely a difference in the sutta than you said, like how it is typically in American insight.
Yeah, that's right.
Retreats and status. So I just it's kind of
Absolutely.
the same
Yeah.
thing when we said, but the second tetrad, I was like, wait a minute, what's going on?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But I'm curious, so I'll be doing it this the rest of the semester, so we'll see
Yeah,
how
yeah.
it goes.
Yeah, that's really a great question. It's not just an American Buddhism thing, by the way. It's a Buddhism thing. So, there's so many things that can be said about this topic, but let me start somewhere. In Theravada Buddhism, there is this ubiquitous and highly influential commentary called the Visuddhimagga, or the Path of Purification, right? And due to certain historical um, reasons, this text has risen to the status of becoming a sort of all-encompassing interpretive lens through which Theravadins used to interpret all the other suttas, right? And the commentary introduced a lot of new ideas, like, oh, going into jhanas, you need to fuse your attention into this light, right? Jhana is about shamatha, it's about concentration, it's about this non-dual absorption, right? Um, you know, I- we can go on and on and on, right? Insight, involves these stages of development. And at the final stage, you experience a cessation in consciousness, and then you come into contact with Nibbana. All these very interesting ideas that are nowhere to be found in suttas, and in fact are oftentimes in patent contradiction with what the suttas presented. So, we will be talking a great deal about this for the remainder of the semester on why is it that people feel burnout in meditation practice, the most common reasons. Why is it that they experience headaches? Why is it that, like the more they try to gaze, try to fix their attention, the more they feel like restless and so forth. Yeah. I really believe that the early Buddhist meditation presents a path that is very accessible, sensible. It respects the human condition. So we're not dealing with something really highfalutin, that can only be accomplished by superhumans. Like once you understand the basic principles of meditation works, you go, wow, like how can we not meditate? Yeah. Okay, any other thoughts or questions before we move on?
I have one question about
Yes,
a
please.
comment you made during lecture. You said something about how the word concentration can be misleading. Can you
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
tell me about
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. So, okay. Um, earlier I talked about how in the entirety of the early Buddhist suttas, you will not find a meditation technique that's about concentration, as is traditionally understood. Um, there's no meditation technique where you go um, reciting the mantra Om until your mind um, becomes singularly preoccupied with a sound, right? Or staring at or visualizing a part of your body until everything else is excluded, right? And you become like perfectly fused with this chosen object, right? This kind of shamatha practice, this kind of concentration practice is nowhere to be found in the suttas. In the suttas, all the satipatthanas involve the task at hand, a range of activities. So let me give you like a concrete example what I mean by that. How do you practice the body-based satipatthana, let's say everywhere, anywhere? Uh, According to the Buddha, the reason that your mind goes to addictive, corrupting types of pleasure because it is not satisfied here. It does not have food stuff that is immediately available to itself. And so it has to look elsewhere. Oftentimes it has to look really far. It has to strain itself, looking for things that are really external, things that require a lot of concoction, a lot of fabrication. For example, right? Oh, I'm feeling so insecure about my appearance, right? So what do I have to do? I have to spend money, right? Changing my hairdo, right? I'd be thinking about how would people perceive me if I were to drive this kind of car, right? How do I compare with other people in terms of looks? Yes, I may be good looking, but compared to her, compared to him, I don't want to be sitting next to him. He's going to make me look shorter, right? Things like that. When you're doing bodily based satipatthana, one of the things you do, and by the way, this is usually the first piece of meditation instruction the Buddha give when someone newly ordained, and that is learn to relax your body and then protect the sense of ease wherever you are. Now, if you have easy access to physical ease, you will quickly realize that your need for stimulation is greatly tempered. So our need for entertainment is not, something absolute. It's not something fixed. It's really dynamic and it's conditioned. So if your body is all riled up, agitated, and then harboring a lot of tension, then this would give rise to the delusion that you need something very strong to make you happy. You need something very intense. You need something very complex to make you happy. On the other hand, if your body is deeply relaxed and is able to um, bask itself in a sense of ease in almost, uninterrupted way, it changes what you need mentally, how much you need mentally, right? And to practice this, you don't need fixed concentration. You need mindfulness and clear comprehension. You need to understand what you're doing. You have to learn to read the effects of your doing. Let me give you an even more relatable experience. You're frequently driving, on LA freeway, you find yourself tired at the end of the day, right? And so someone reminds you, look, when you're driving, you inadvertently and habitually tense up your shoulder like this. This is the way you drive. Okay? So you know what? Be more mindful of that fact. Change the way you drive. So with that new idea in mind, now when you're driving, you go, okay, are my shoulders relaxed? Are my neck relaxed? Do I need to exert myself so much, right? Is this exertion necessary or unnecessary? Right? You would need the necessary exertion in order to keep driving, right? But then a lot of the exertions are unnecessary. A lot of the tensing up is unnecessary. So why don't you moderate that? Why don't you change that? Why don't you drop that? Why don't you relax that? Right? So when you're involved in this kind of practice, do you need one pointed concentration? You don't. You don't. What you need is number one, clear comprehension, okay, which means knowing what you're doing, knowing the effect of what you're doing. You also need mindfulness. What is mindfulness? Mindfulness doesn't mean non-judgmental acceptance of the present moment in early Buddhist context. Okay. The non-judgmental acceptance of the present moment is really equanimity. That's a different Buddhist idea. That's called equanimity, right? Mindfulness in early Buddhist texts really means remembrance. Remembering what? Remembering the frame, the dharmic frame you've learned. Like, for example, how to relax yourself. Why do you want to relax yourself? What are the benefits? How do you do it? Right? The fact that you're able to frequently remind yourself to relax those muscles when you're driving, that's called mindfulness, remembrance. So, in short, what is mindfulness? Is to keep in mind the purpose of practice, to keep in mind how to practice. That's called mindfulness. When you have mindfulness and clear comprehension combined together, what will happen? You will be successful in what you do. You will be able to arrive at those behavioral goals you set out. And what kind of behavioral goals the Buddha set out for us? The eradication of suffering. Why do I describe it as a behavioral goal? Because suffering is put together through your behavior. Therefore, it can be dissolved, it can be unraveled by reconditioning, letting go of behaviors.
So you're saying that sati is an epistemology?
Sati, well, epistemology is really a method of knowing, or like the art of knowledge and so forth. Sati um, is really a frame that you keep. So let me give you another example. So, um, my mother is telling me, "Look, you are frowning all the time. This is a very bad habit on your part." Okay, so I've resolved to change this habit, and my mother's voice becomes a sort of mindfulness in the mind. Inside there is my mother going, remember, don't frown. Right? If you don't frown, you're going to look like a much more appealing person, much more personable person, a happier person, right? Attractive person, what have you. Remember, right? And then I also remember how to unfrown myself, so to speak, right? I'm able to detect the muscles that are involved and so forth. So mindfulness is a remembrance. Why is it important? Because human intention is simultaneously powerful and weak in the Buddha's assessment. Okay. It's very, very weak, so that the Buddha described it as kind of like plantain tree. That was the analogy the Buddha used, right? Meaning that it's contained of bundles of habits, right? And you could peel at them and they could be changed. They're so fickle. They come from nowhere. They're really not self. You wield no absolute control over your intention, right? In the morning, you feel like, I'm going to meditate. I'm going to be a good practitioner. In the afternoon, you're like, just, like, let me have two more gambling sessions before I restart my meditation program. Something like that, right? But then on the other hand, human intention is also very strong. When and how to make it strong? When mindfulness is involved. When you're able to connect together these disparate instances of intention and give them one concerted purpose. right? So if for an extended period of time, you can consistently apply your intention to an unchanging goal, right? It becomes very strong. Okay. So if the word concentration is to be used in Buddhism, it is about this. It is about your ability to stay consistent to the purpose. That's what concentration, if what you mean by concentration is this, then I have no problem with the word. But usually when people use the word concentration, they think about something else. So concentration, in other words, is the allocation of mental resources to a consistent and concerted purpose. So defined in such a way, then I have no problem that concentration plays a very important role in meditation, right? Or even in the idea of mindfulness. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions before we move on? Okay, so another example I can think of, that's different from the popular presentation of Buddhism or in mainstream Theravada Buddhism in general, is the fact that early Buddhist meditation is dynamic in nature. What do I mean by that? If you go to a typical Buddhist retreat, chances are you will be given one single technique. You will repeat that technique, right, in an almost mechanical way. The assumption is that, okay, your mind right now is not concentrated enough, and you need to concentrate your mind on this technique, right? And then once your mind becomes very concentrated in this technique, it will magically produce some kind of beneficial effects, right? But in early Buddhism, you see a range of activity, dynamic activity. You are constantly in the role of assessing how you are doing, what you are doing, the effect. And you use that as a feedback to modify the way you use techniques. Okay. Now, yes, eventually, as you become very proficient in this process, the mind will really calm down. You will enter into the so-called samadhi, right? You will enter into unification of mind. You will enter into something called the chitta ekagata, right? The the coming together, the unification of the mind, right? You go into profound peace, stability, unwaveringness, and so on and so forth. There is that in the early Buddhist tradition, absolutely. But the way to go into that is not through deadpan repetition of the same technique. It's really about, you're acting kind of like I don't know, what's a good analogy, like a mother to a child, your mind being the child. And then you tell the child, don't do this. And your mind immediately rebels, right? And you realize, oh, the way I say don't do this is too harsh, right? Maybe it's too forceful. So why don't I, hey, sweetheart, why don't we try this other thing, right? So you soften your approach, right? And you observe the effect. And you notice that, hey, maybe the mind does comply more willingly. Or another possibility is the mind becomes very lax as a result because it lacks discipline. It really needed the authority figure. Right? And then you need to firm up. You needed to firm up. The suttas are filled with such examples, right? You're trying different things, you're getting feedback, and then you're modifying your approach. And then as you do this, then eventually there are moments of samadhi. And even in those moments of samadhi, your mind doesn't go into blank. The purpose remains with you. That sense of directionality remains with you. So even when you're in a samadhi, in a like a absorbed state, in a concentrated state, your mental defilements are continue being deconditioned. You don't just go into like a sleep-like state or a coma-like state, right? You're just applying the same technique more consistently. Yeah. Righty. So give me just one second here. And so, as I was saying, the dynamic nature of the Anapana practice, the approaches covered in the sutta include the following: assessment of activities, techniques, and their effects, right? Reading the effects. You want to know what you're doing. You don't want to just treat um, this meditation practice as a sort of panacea, as a sort of magical bullet. You have to understand that it is a contrivance. It is an act in exertion, right? It is a use of your attention. And so you have to know how you're using it. You need to know what is its effect. And frequently, you are developing sensitivity. It's not enough that, oh, you experience happiness. No, you want to become more sensitive to happiness. You want to become more sensitive to pleasure. Sensitivity is something that can be trained. And with sensitivity, with heightened sensitivity, your relationship with experiences change. Sometimes you're engaged in relaxation techniques. Sometimes you're trying to create conditions to predispose the mind to joy, happiness, and bliss and comfort. Lacking those conditions, your mind is very unlikely to experience happiness. Right? Sometimes you're calming mental activities. Right? Sometimes you are learning to discern, to perceive drawbacks in a certain mode of activity. In other words, the limitation of it. Let me give you a very, very concrete example of what I mean by that. Recognizing the limitation, the drawbacks of an activity. Let's say you're practicing compassion. You're trying to cultivate a sense of compassion. You're imbuing your mind with a sense of balanced compassion. Is this a good state? Yes, in general. Is this the best state, the highest state? No, not in early Buddhism. I understand in later forms of Buddhism, compassion is conflated, right? It's the end all be all and all that, but not in early Buddhism. Compassion is a mental state. It's a fabrication in early Buddhism. So the Buddha said, compared to enmity, compared to animosity, compared to non-forgivingness, compared to anger, is compassion better? Yes. Yes, it is. But is it the best? No. No, it is not. And so once you're in a state of compassion, and you're able to see what are the effects. Well, one of the most immediate effect is when you abide in compassion for the whole day, what will happen to you? The suttas explicitly say that you begin to feel tired. You begin to feel burnout, right? Yes, it's good to think good thoughts, but you know what? I'm sick and tired of good thoughts sometimes. Right? So is there something higher? Yes, absolutely. There are a number of suttas where the Buddha said, once the purpose of compassion has been fulfilled, then what do? You withdraw from it. You take a rest from it. You let that go. Right? And maybe you are able to recognize the impermanent nature of compassion. That's one way to do it. Maybe you're able to recognize the stressful nature of compassion. That's another way to go. Maybe you're able to recognize that compassion involves the use of perception, the use of attention, the use of all these mental resources, and therefore is a concocted state. It's something that you're actively putting together. It's not a natural state. Okay, and therefore you let go. There's so many different ways that you could train yourself so as to be able to discern limitation, unsatisfactoriness, or drawbacks, or even so-called dangers. This is another Buddhist terminology, right? In a mode of behavior. And as a result of recognizing a drawback, what happens to the mind? The mind happily rises above it. The mind willingly withdraws from it so that you're not forcing your mind to let go of something, but rather your mind is just, mature enough so it's grown tired, wary of a toy that it used to play and moves on naturally. That's a way the Buddha trains, right? Moving on. And so I'm kind of repeating myself here. Meditation approaches described in the Anapanasati Sutta are much more varied, dynamic, holistic than the way meditation is taught by most. A whole set of skills are developed, and the approaches are dynamic, not just observational techniques. In other words, the Buddha doesn't teach a just watch, right? Just be mindful, right? Just, stay in the present moment. That's not the way the Buddha taught, right? And also, another thing is that in early Buddhist meditation, insight apparently doesn't just arise from mechanical seeing the three characteristics, but mostly from the experiential exercise of techniques. For example, of how the creation and maintenance of any self requires exertion. What do I mean by this? In the commentarial tradition, okay, once again, if you don't remember, we were trying to create a distinction, right? On the one hand, you have what the early suttas taught. On the other hand, you have what the commentaries say. And the commentaries have become so influential over time, they eclipse, right? They kind of supplanted what the suttas say. So in the commentaries, it teaches that there are these three most important characteristics that you want to observe: impermanence, dukkha, and not self. All right, in the commentaries, it's no self, but in the sutta, is more likely to be not self. But in any case, putting that aside. So, per the commentaries, what is Buddhist meditation about? Buddhist meditation really is just about observation, being able to observe the three characteristics in all your experiences, seeing that all experiences are impermanent, seeing that all phenomena are dukkhic, right, are suffering, seeing all experiences are no self. Right. That's kind of like the end all be all. Everything else is kind of considered distraction. Right. In the suttas, yes, the Buddha did teach observation techniques, but that's not the bulk of it. For someone to truly understand an experience, you don't just watch it, you interact with it. That's the way the Buddha taught. So it's kind of like if you want to become a really good gardener, you don't just read books or you don't just watch a master gardener doing his or her trade. You actually want to get your hands dirty. You want to touch the soil, know what compost feels like, right? And you want to smell the compost. You want to smell the soil. You could tell from the color, from the texture, from the odor, fragrance, and so on and so forth. You develop very intimate knowledge of gardening. Right? And the Buddha really believes that the mind is kind of like, he doesn't exactly use these words, okay, but I think this is quite evident in his way of thinking that the mind is kind of like a lab, and you're playing with these different variables. And it's in the interacting with these different variables that you develop an intimate understanding of the nature of the mind. You come to know how the mind creates suffering. You come to know intimately, intuitively, how the mind surrenders those activities that generate suffering. Okay. So it's more of an interactive endeavor than a pure watching kind of meditation. All right. So at this point, I want to give you like a very compact, very succinct overview of what early Buddhist meditation is about. Okay. Um, Previously, we mentioned the expression gradual pacification of sankhara. The Buddha used this expression frequently. In fact, on at least one occasion, when he was asked, what was your teaching about? He said, gradual pacification of sankharas. Right? This is translated into Chinese frequently as 诸行见似止息. Okay. What does that mean? Number one, what are sankharas? We talked about this 2 weeks ago, right? Don't worry if you're have already totally forgotten about it. Let me repeat myself. What are sankharas? Sankharas is really worth repeating because it's a central idea in the Buddhist teaching. If you want to understand samsara, cycles of rebirth, you need to understand sankhara. If you want to understand nibbana, you want to understand sankhara, right? According to the Buddha, what is nibbana? The most frequent definition is the resolution of sankhara. The resolution of sankhara, the ending of sankhara. Okay. And uh, so what are sankharas? All right. When an experience arises, let's say I'm seeing something. I see your face. All right, here is the arising of experience. It, things don't stop there. The mind is in the habit of responding to that experience in so many different ways. The mind is in the habit of participating in that experience in so many ways. So, for example, in an act of seeing, right, seeing your face, the mind immediately goes, I like it. I don't like it. All right. Or, meh, neutral. Right. Or the mind goes, you are someone. I am another person. Right. Actually, in the pure experience itself, there's no such dichotomy. But the mind immediately identifies with one portion of the experience, right? Let's say your body, and go, that's me. That's where I am. And the rest of the world, right? The rest of the experience is what? Is not me, is you, is them, is the world, and so on. These are activities, right? As soon as there's seeing, you feel like I am seeing. I'm the owner of sight, right? As soon as you experience something, the mind immediately respond. So what are some examples of sankharas? What are examples of these activities that the mind is engaging in? The mind is always trying to become something. The mind is always trying to own something. The mind is always trying to be someone, to localize itself, to define itself, to assert itself. The mind is always trying to extract pleasure. The mind is always leaning on something, depending on something. Right? There are all these things that the mind like immediately do. It's not necessarily like a conscious deliberation on your part. It's not like, oh, you decided that in the next moment, when this experience arises, I'm going to choose to be this person. No, there's such a strong habit on the part of the mind. This habit is fueled by ignorance and craving. What is craving? It is a mental thirst. So the activities don't come from nowhere. Why is the mind so busy involving in things, reacting to things, participating in things, being things? Because it is thirsty, because the craving is still embedded in the mind. And then I also mentioned ignorance. What is ignorance? I understand that in later forms of Buddhism, ignorance has been given all sorts of fancy and very philosophical definition, oftentimes um, commentarily inspired and so forth, right? But really, what is ignorance? Ignorance is your failure to examine habits. So if you allow the habits to proliferate without your examining them, right? Kind of obliviously, unawareingly allow the same behavioral cycle to repeat itself, right? So that the mind stays hungry, the mind stays reactive to all things, participating in things, responding to things, being things, without realizing what it's doing, without realizing how these activities are generating suffering. That's ignorance. So ignorance is obliviousness to habits, right? Allowing habits to remain unexamined. And so you what? You fall prey to the same suffering creating habits again and again and again and again. Okay, so in this regard, the Buddha was very much a psychologist. He employed a lot of psychological principles without naming them as such, right? But they are highly reminiscent. They're really very strong correlate between the Buddhist teaching and what you will find in behavioral therapy, what you will find in cognitive psychology and so forth. Yeah, being a Buddhist, I'd be biased. I am biased. So I would say that, well, compared to modern psychology, the Buddha is even more profound, right? He talked about even subtler aspects of psychology, but that's a whole other issue. Yeah. Okay, so that's the Sankara part. Sankharas are what? Activities, reactions, responses, participation, identification. That's the Sankhara part. So Sankhara disturbs peace all the time. Therefore, you experience samsara, rounds of rebirth. You're always what? In the process of becoming someone else. You're always hungry for new experiences. You're always trying to protect some experiences. You're always trying to run away from some experiences. You're always trying to fend off the world because you are someone and you need it to preserve your personal boundary. You're always in a dualistic, almost antagonistic relationship with something, with the world. You're a separate individual, lonely, vulnerable. The whole universe is besieging you, right? You will die. You will get sick, right? Because you think you're the body. You think you're this person, right? And you have all these limitations. You're not tall enough. You're not handsome enough. You're not rich enough. You're not good looking enough. You're not knowledgeable enough. Heck, you're not spiritually awakened enough, right? And so, how do you stop the sankharas? And you go, oh, that sounds easy enough. Why don't I just stop acting? Stop doing anything. Try it. Number one, you will find it impossible, right? Number two, if you're a little more watchful, you'll realize that your attempt to stop yourself is itself an activity. Does that make sense? When you go, stop doing, mind, quiet down, right? Sankharas, cease. When you do that, this itself is a sankhara. So, how do you do it? Now, once again, the Buddha defines nibbana as resolution of sankhara as asangata, 无为, 无作, right? Devoid of doership, devoid of ownership, devoid of personhood, and so on and so forth. Why? Why is personhood a thing? Personhood is doing. If you believe you're someone, the mind is doing something. The mind is defining. The mind is delighting. I love being this person. I am enjoying being this person. I revel at the fact. I find comfort in being this familiar person. Right. And so you're selfing, you're being someone, you're attaching to a self is a sankhara, is a sankhara. So how do we stop it? You can't just force it. On the one hand, the Buddha Dharma, the Buddha's teaching is very simple. All right, I've summed it up for you in the matter of 30 minutes. It's very simple. On the other hand, it's very hard because you'll find it almost impossible to do it. So what are our options? Gradual pacification of sankharas. What does that mean? All right. So you cannot let go of everything at once, but you can let go a portion of it and replace it with something superior. Okay. So let me give you a very concrete example. Generally, the spiritual path as prescribed by the Buddha involved kind of the following sequence. Number one, you want to replace unskillful with the skillful. Okay, the akusala with the kusala, right? You want to replace a skillful with something even more skillful. You want to replace something that's even more skillful with something that is non-fashioning, meaning that it involves less and less exertion, less and less ardor, less and less control, less and less ownership, less and less unnecessary tension, and so forth. Okay. So, being an unskillful person means that you're overwhelmed with activities and you're very inefficient at procuring happiness for yourself. Remember, the mind is always thirsty before it is liberated, right? So in Buddhism, there are not really sinful people. There are not really evil people, but there are people who are very inefficient at procuring happiness. So let's say if your way of procuring happiness for yourself is by beating down others, right? By bullying another person and proving your superiority, you're stronger, you're more in control, you're the alpha dog, right? That's pretty unskillful. Unskillful, not in a purely moralistic sense. Unskillful in that it's so inefficient. It has so many drawbacks. It is so limiting. It's so ungratifying. It creates so many unmanageable consequences. Okay. And, you know, is the Buddha teaching people to become good people? Not in the moralistic sense, but in the sankhara sense. If you are a quote unquote good person, it means that you tend to live without remorse. You tend to live without having to compartmentalize. You tend to be able to be at ease, right? Because it's much easier to um, be forthright, be candid with people, and to be true to yourself than to hold a secret agenda and to wear, complex masks and to try to exploit and to deceive and to keep track of the multiple lines of lies that you told. Right? It's much easier. You're much more likely to experience well-being, a sense, higher forms of happiness, sense of well-being, than whatever sort of pleasure you can finagle out by manipulating people. Okay, that's really why the Buddha teaches skillfulness, not from a moralistic sense. No. Okay, the Buddha oftentimes contradicts worldly ideas of morality, by the way. The Buddha's idea with regards to worldly morality is sometimes when it doesn't contradict with the Buddhist purpose, then we respect it. We respect the worldly moral convention, right? Sometimes we actively encourage those parts of worldly moral convention that actually would help and facilitate spiritual goals. Right? Sometimes we contradict, sometimes we put aside, we completely ignore, we go against what the world says is virtuous. Right? I can give you many examples of this. For example, in the society that the Buddha lived in, filial piety was a big thing. Respect to your parents, right? Compliance to their wishes, and so forth. Was the Buddha a very good example in that regard? No, he was absolutely not. The parents begged him not to ordain, right? The parents told him to do this, to do that. I go, no, not good enough for me. Nope, I'm moving on. Nope. What about if you just stay for one more year and produce more grandchildren for us? Then you become a monk. Nope, moving on. So he was not a very good example of worldly morality, right? Okay, now coming back to what we're talking about, gradual pacification of sankharas is a natural process where your mind will not feel deprived. If you let go of sankhara, if you pacify sankhara, and thereby leaving your mind more hungry as a result, then your strategy will backfire. That's not the right way to move forward. Why does the Buddha teach jhana? Jhana, these deep meditative stations. Because when you have something more pleasurable, more gratifying, as a result of practicing dispassion, then you happily let go of attachment. Okay. Let me use a very crude example to explain the psychology. Let's say my girlfriend is leaving me. Okay, this is a completely hypothetical scenario. Okay, so I'm happily married and all that, right? So let's say my girlfriend is leaving me. How would I respond to that? Now, it's possible for me to go, right? Or like, oh no, this is the end of my existence, right? Without you, I don't know what happiness is, right? Happiness is impossible without you. Please don't go, right? Or I will, like feel exceedingly jealous and angry and right. Or I'll feel, okay, fine, maybe, you know. What contributes to that difference? How confident I am, what sort of self-esteem I have, right? How efficiently I can regulate my emotions and make myself feel good in the absence of my girlfriend. So when you are walking on the path of dispassion, which means letting go, right? You're walking on the path of recognizing mental thirst and surrendering. There is a way to do it that will paradoxically make you feel better, more confident, more satisfied, more content, more at peace. There's another way to do it where you'll feel deprived. You're fighting. You're using willpower. You know, the attachment is wrong, is bad, and I need to detach myself, blah, blah, blah. The Buddha described this path as the middle path. This word has been frequently misunderstood. It doesn't just mean shunning away from asceticism, shunning away from sensual indulgence. It doesn't mean that in the early Buddhist context. Right? The Buddha is saying that all these other contemporaneous teachers, and there are many contemporaneous teachers who were just like the Buddha, have identified craving to be a problem, but the path they prescribed involved just denying yourself of happiness, just denying yourself of pleasurable experiences. And the Buddha says, actually, no, there can be a pleasant abiding in the here and now, where as you are letting go, you paradoxically experience greater fulfillment. And you become even more convinced that this is the right path. So therefore, you will continue in the same direction. That's what the middle path really is about. Okay, so that's what the gradual pacification is about. If you still find this idea very abstract, very difficult to understand, think about the following analogy. You know what a hermit crab is, right? Hermit crab, finds itself a little shell and like use it as its shelter, as its house, right? And then eventually over time it outgrows its first house, its first shell, right? It leaves behind the shell and finds a bigger one. It's kind of like that. And, you know, in stages in your life, are you transitioning to a more skillful, less fabricated abiding, right? And then also in moment after moment, right? Are you able to rise above, transition into a more skillful, less fabricated abiding until you reach a point when the mind is ripe enough to surrender all abiding, to surrender any need to dwell, to perch upon, to find its location. Right? Any question about that, very brief overview of what early Buddhist meditation is about? Okay, well, if not, we're going to take a short break and we will be back in, let's say, 15 minutes, so 10:40. Okay, see you. Okay, welcome back. So earlier we were talking about the goal of Buddhist meditation is the cessation, the letting go of sankharas. However, when um, this is not done correctly, as you are trying to let go, trying to bring to cessation sankharas, you may end up with a sense of deprivation. You may end up feeling dry, not fulfilled, right? That you are missing out on pleasures and so forth. But then the path that the Buddha prescribed and described is called a pleasant abiding here and now. It means that even as you are letting go of and bring to cessation sankharas, you actually end up with a greater sense of ease, fulfillment, contentment, joy, and so forth. And these experiences, give me 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. And so the Buddha said that there is a way. And when you train in bringing to cessation or letting go of sankharas, this is not accompanied by dryness, by sense of deprivation, and so forth, but instead by fulfillment, by satisfaction, by ease, by peace. And the result which is you become convinced, you become even more established on the path, and therefore you are willing to let go of even subtler sankharas until there are no more sankharas left to be given up. And this is where the idea jhana comes in. You probably have heard of the term, right? If you hang out in Buddha circles long enough, you probably have heard of the term jhanas or dhyanas, right? Oftentimes understood to be a sort of meditative absorption, right? It's a result of superhuman concentration, if you will, right? Is a result of your staring into a light and working with the so-called jhana nimitta, the counterpart image, and so on and so forth. But when you read the early suttas, the jhanas are described very differently. How do you go into first jhana? How do you go into second jhana, third jhana, fourth jhana? They have nothing to do with your concentrative power. They have everything to do with whether you are able to find greater fulfillment and ease as you let go of sankharas. For that reason, jhanas in the suttas are described as renunciation pleasure, seclusion pleasure, self-awakening pleasure, right? Peace pleasure, right? Equanimity pleasure, right? And so on and so forth. It is not a product of your manipulating your breath, manipulating your attention in a certain way. It has more to do with your right view, actually. How willing you are to let go. How clearly you are able to perceive the dukkha, the stress that is inherent in the coarser types of sankhara, the coarser types of activities. Jhana is still sustained by very subtle activities, but when you go into jhana, you've already secluded yourself, you've already given up coarser types of sankhara, and you're experiencing great satisfaction as a result of shielding yourself from the unsettling, the upsetting, the disturbing effect of the coarser sankharas. And then finally, there's another thing I wanted to introduce to you today. It has to do with the way the 16 steps of Anapanasati are organized, are sequenced. Now, most of you, when you look at these so-called 16 steps, you might assume that they are straightforwardly sequential, meaning that step number one is where you start, step number 16 is where you end, and depending on how high the number is, the step is that much more difficult. So step number 15 is more difficult than step number 13, for example, right? And it's necessarily built on step number 13. And this assumption is reinforced by the commentarial tradition. The commentarial tradition frequently talks about these steps in terms of a calm and insight dichotomy. Right? First, you focus and concentrate on your breath until you enter into jhana, and then jhanas are somehow devoid of insight according to the commentaries. And you step out of the jhana, then you proceed to contemplate on impermanence, and then you cultivate insight, and this is how you train in these 16 steps. Now, there are many evidence showing that's not how the 16 steps are understood at all. To give you an example, some of these steps, they appear independently in different suttas. For example, there is a sutta called the uh, Kaya Katta Sati Sutta, which featured steps 1, 2, 4, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. And per the sutta, these 4 steps are self-sufficient in taking a person all the way to full liberation. Right? So in other words, you don't need all 16 steps to completely liberate yourself. In fact, 1, 2, 3, 4 comprises a self-containing system, a sufficient system. You could take just steps 1 to 4 as a representation of the entire path, and that could potentially work. Elsewhere, right, in other suttas, you see the feeling-based steps being featured independently. And they are taken to be self-sufficient. They're taken to be an entire path unto itself, are capable of delivering the practitioner all the way to full liberation. Okay. So number one, the 16 steps, they're organized into 4 groups, as I mentioned earlier. Each group is a self-containing, sufficient system. You can focus on the body-based satipatthana. Theoretically, that's enough. You could just focus on the second group, the feeling-based. You could just focus on the mind-based. You could just focus on the dharma-based, right? And theoretically, that should be enough. Now, you might ask then, if any one of those 4 groups is self-sufficient, why bother with all 4? Couldn't we make the semester easier just by focusing on 1, 2, 3, 4? Potentially, yes. If that is the collective desire, right? on your part. But there is something to be said about learning all 16, about experimenting, about dabbling in all 16. Chances are you will be like me, who, even though have chosen to focus on, I don't know, the second group. This is kind of your main practice, right? But as a result of your dabbling in the other groups, you've learned something about your own main group. These steps, they potentially can be mutually illuminating. So even though you may be a practitioner who focuses on bodily sankhara, bodily exertion, but your occasional meandering into, excursion into mental exertion help you better understand body. That's a distinct possibility. In fact, you might find that as you progress in meditative practice, the boundary between mind and body becomes increasingly arbitrary. They seem to blur, right? And you seem to just be working with this, which is your experience, which is the mind, right? So that's a possibility, right? And personally, I found that your learning all 16 really gives you a very multifaceted, holistic view of the Buddha's training program, right? Yes, the Buddha oftentimes taught in an anecdotal way, right? Like based on the audience's temperament, based on the audience level understanding, his or her unique karmic composition, he taught differently, right? And any individual does not need to learn everything the Buddha has to offer in order to have a chance of full liberation. You don't, the Buddha would not want you to be like that either, right? But on the other hand, if somehow you could afford to know something about the other aspects of the Buddha's teaching, you oftentimes will be able to find inspiration for your own path. So you'll be inspired in oftentimes unexpected ways, if you will. Okay. So once again, those four groups, they're not sequential. It is not the case that bodily based satipatthana is the easiest necessarily, right? It's kind of like a universal entry point for all anapanasati practitioners. That's not the point. That's really not the case at all. Okay, you can start out with step number 5, 6, 7, 8, all right, or you could just stay there, right? You just focus these. You could choose these to be kind of your mainstay, right? The last group of four is not necessarily the highest, the hardest, right? The culminating points for the 16 steps. That's not the case at all. Okay. But then for the sake of having some kind of order in this class, we're just going to go through the 16 from 1 to 16, from 1 to 16. Okay. Without conveying, you know, um, the idea that, oh, this is the way the practice should necessarily unfold. Any question, any comments about what we say? Okay, well, if not,
Quick question.
yes, please, go ahead.
So as we start practicing or going through the the four steps or the four categories of steps, um, are we writing on based on our experience of each step per week or
Yeah,
um,
okay, yeah. So some weeks we will not be able to cover the entire tetrad, the entire group of four, right? And some weeks we'll only be able to cover one technique or two techniques of
okay.
any given tetrad. Then just write on that. Just experiment on those, just on that one or two techniques. Yeah. And
Okay.
by the way, don't worry. I'm not a stickler about things. I'm not going to go, this week we talked about step 3, but you ended up writing step number 2. Okay, minus 5 points, on your. That's not going to happen. All right. Like I said, your weekly assignments is really for your own perusal. Okay, I'm not even going to comment on them or respond to your written contents without your actively soliciting me to do so. Okay, so don't worry about that part. Just write something that you are experimenting with for that week. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
Hi, Professor.
Yes.
Dude, have you got my email? Um,
No, I haven't. No.
oh, well, at least I sent an email to you last week.
Okay.
My emails with 3 questions. And the first one is about how can I write, just a weekly assignment, something like every week or something like that, right? just a weekly assignment?
So as we said, on the weeks where we're not actively exploring the specific techniques, you don't have to write anything. So, which is the case for this week as well, right? We
Mm-hmm.
haven't really delved into steps number one, two, three, four specifically. Right? I'm giving you
Okay.
kind of like an overview. Yeah, and
Yeah.
so at the beginning of the semester, I did mention that our first two classes will be kind of
Mm-hmm.
like theoretical. We'll be talking basically,
Mm-hmm.
and then
Mm-hmm.
starting next week, most likely we'll begin to delve into the practical side of things.
Okay.
Yeah,
It
that's when
means
you start writing.
every week I just practice and apply some techniques. All right, about the sutta practice, and then I just write something about my feeling, my experience, or something like that, right?
You write about um, the 1 hour that
Mm-hmm.
you dedicated to experimenting with that technique, right?
Okay.
It could be done in segments of 10 minutes, 15 minutes, like two
Mm-hmm.
segments of 30 minutes, or it could be done in one session, right?
Okay.
Whatever technique we happen to cover for that week, you um, work with it, you experiment with it on your own for a total of an hour, right? After which you write about
Mm-hmm.
your experience, right? Maybe what how you're understanding this technique, what exactly you did, using your own words if you prefer, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh, what sort of things you've experienced, frustration, or what you perceive to be failure, right? Success, what you
Mm-hmm.
take to be second jhana, like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
oh,
Yeah.
whatever the case might be. So it's a phenomenological report. As
Mm-hmm.
I explained, if you practice these techniques with
Mm-hmm.
the goal of wanting to describe your experience as concretely as you can, it kind of help you set up a mental frame in which you can potentially be more investigative, in which you
Mm-hmm.
may potentially to be, a little more um, observant of what is going on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, in total, for this semester, how many assignments I have to submit? Just 10 or 12?
I don't know
It,
yet.
yes.
It could be that we ended up, using, I don't know, 13 classes to talk about the 16 steps, or 10 classes to talk about the 16 steps. I don't know. Once again,
Oh no,
number
just
one,
for a weekly assignment. I mean, just
yeah.
weekly assignment, not for all the assignment. Yes.
Number one, please be reminded, I'm not a stickler for things. Okay,
Uh-huh.
so this is not your typical content class, if you will. Things
Yeah,
are
yeah,
pretty casual, right? So you're showing up here, taking regular attendance, and you're doing some weekly assignment. You're going to be okay, all
yeah.
right? So that's the first part. And second part, I will try to
Mm-hmm.
remind you every
Yeah.
week whether
Mm-hmm.
or not you need to write a weekly assignment and on what,
Uh-huh.
right? So for this week, you don't. You don't have to write anything. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because just I need to know that because I just want to plan for all the whole things for the whole semester for me. I can do something. I just plan something for me. Yeah, that's why I just need in total. Yeah.
You're free to write weekly assignment regardless of
Okay.
what I say. So you could
Yeah.
write, like this week, you're welcome to write a weekly assignment on what you understand, what you
Okay.
taken away, what you disagree with,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
what you
Yeah.
agree with, whatever. Yeah, you're welcome to do so. You don't have to. Not for this week, at least. But
All right.
yeah,
Okay.
if
Thank you.
it
I love
helps
that.
you better
Yeah.
organize, then turn in one thing every week.
Okay. Yes. All right. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, sure. Any other thoughts, questions? So I want to say a few more things about this idea of jhana, which is featured very prominently in early Buddhism. I know that in some modern contexts, this is somewhat of a taboo, right? There is this very questionable idea that, oh, somehow we live in a Dharma degenerate age and it's possible to attain jhanas. This, by the way, is really an apocryphal assertion, right? The source really comes from um, materials that are compiled many centuries after the Buddha's passing, right? So this is not canonical, at least not in my view, right? The idea of a Dharma degenerate age and somehow our capacity to practice is diminished as a result, right? And there are also people who believe that jhanas are kind of like unnecessary distraction, or especially people hailing from a um, so-called pure vipassana tradition, right? I think that the Buddha Dharma is all about just watching, right? It's all about just understanding the so-called three characteristics, right? And I respect that position and understand that there is a unique soteriology that they are presenting. But once again, I would say that that's a point of view very different from what you can see in early Buddhist texts. In early Buddhist texts, jhana is central, right? It's figured very prominently. In fact, there are dozens of suttas where the Buddha said that the jhana is the path. The jhana is the Eightfold Noble Path. The jhana is right concentration. Jhana is the one single ingredient that leads to the ending of affluence, meaning the eradication of all mental defilements. Now, I understand why there are people who think that jhanas are necessary distraction because they understand jhana to be concentrative practice, right? But once again, in the suttas, what are jhanas? Jhanas, content-wise, is exactly as the Satipatthana, is the 16 steps. Okay. This is not my opinion. I could show you dozens of suttas where this is clearly indicated to be the case. Now, you can practice Satipatthana, right, the establishing of mindfulness, in a way where you're not content, where you're frustrated, where you find letting go to be painful and depriving yourself of, like very basic um, food stuff, right? That's one possibility. But as you become more proficient in Satipatthana practice, you're likely to find that letting go of something will not only not deprive you of happiness, it actually enhances it. It actually makes you feel more satisfied, makes you feel more at peace, more whole, and so forth. Now we're getting into jhanic territory. So if I were to be forced, to be compelled to give a very short definition of jhana, or not definition, but explanation of jhana, what is it? It is the increasingly stabilized contentment, fulfillment, and peace that directly results from your dispassion, seclusion, letting go process. To the point where the hindrances do not arise. You're no longer bothered by things like, oh, but I'm lonely when I'm practice, right? Oh, I feel so restless. I feel so agitated. Right? I'm so bothered by pain, right? I'm bored out of my mind. I am, like missing, I don't know, spending time with my romantic partner so much. All these hindrances, they will naturally subside, right? You will no longer be plagued with doubts, with uncertainty, like, what am I doing? What is this about? You will increasingly see the point. You will increasingly be clear about your sense of direction, right? You will increasingly understand the mechanism with which this is working, right? How suffering can actually be eradicated, not through blind faith, right? Not through some, artificial rituals that people perform, right? Not through some kind of ideology that you have internalized from your choice of Buddhist school, but from directly working with the mind. and knowing how it works. Any comments or question about that very brief overview of jhanas? Okay, if not,
I have a
yes, please.
question.
Please, Sarah.
So are jhanic states indefinite? Can I mean they fluctuate? Like if say you're practicing and then you see a breakthrough, but then you fall back into old habits. So how does
Yes.
that work?
Yes. Okay. Very, very good question. So unlike the supramundane fruitions, the jhanic states fluctuate exactly as you talked about. Okay. Because they're maintained by sankharas, they're maintained by your intention. They're a fabricated state, right? It's like you're telling yourself, relax, relax, relax. It's a fabrication. Okay, so they fluctuate, yes, right? But with skill, right, as you become better and better working with the mind, becoming more efficient at effortlessness, at letting go, and things like that, jhanas tend to stabilize. And there are states of jhanas, like for lack of better terms, can best be described as imperturbable, just unwavering. It feels like you're never going to ever deviate from this natural peace. It could be a delusion or it could be real. Right. Um, so there is that. Now, however, in the Buddhist teaching, there are many techniques, there are many ways you could properly deal with this fluctuation so that it does not lead to just frustration. It actually leads to you're becoming more seasoned, you're becoming wiser. Right? So every so-called failure, every so-called fluctuation actually leads to your developing even more understanding of the momentum your enemies blow. Right? You're kind of like this Tai Chi master, right? You're just developing muscle affinity, this intuitive understanding of how force works. How do you create space so as to allow that force to naturally subside? How do you step out of the way? Right? When to confront that force? Right? So it's not a bad thing that jhanas fluctuate. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions before we move on? All right. So I'm going to I'm going to end the class on two more things. The first two steps. The first two steps of the 16 steps. You might recall. The first two steps are knowing long breath, knowing short breath, right? Okay. What is that about? Now, the commentaries generally tell us that it is about your watching the breath, and then you start out with watching long breaths and you end up with shorter breaths. Why? Because you become more concentrated, maybe, I don't know, like uh, your overall metabolism is slowed down and therefore slow breath is preferred, right? So the idea is that you want to transition from long breaths to short breaths. However, when we compare the different sister suttas of the Anapanasati, we get the idea that there are quite a few variations when it comes to steps 1 and 2. So in some presentation, it's not about long breath and short breath. It's about deep breath and shallow breath. Okay. So in other words, these two steps are not necessarily just about the length or the duration of your inhalation exhalation, but rather they're about different possible ways you can breathe. Please understand that the 16 steps, just as is the case with most meditation instructions contained in early Buddhist texts, they are mnemonically abridged, meaning that for the sake of helping people to memorize, only the gist of the teaching is contained therein, right? A lot is left unsaid, right? So these are highly compact meditation instructions. And oftentimes it requires a living community to unpack the meaning of these codes, these highly abridged meditation instruction. And it's the same thing with regards to steps 1 and 2. So it's not just about long breath, short breath. It's also about, when you breathe, do you breathe very hurriedly? Do you breathe slowly? Do you breathe deeply, shallowly, right? The different manners in which you breathe. And what is this about? Is this about training your concentration? Is this kind of like counting your breath, where you train your attention on the number and then the breath and eventually weeding out um, distractive thoughts? Maybe there's a small element of that, but primarily it is not about that. So if you were to look at the way the Buddha taught meditation in general, right? So for example, how did he teach his 7-year-old son, Rahula, when Rahula first became a monk? Anyone happen to know the very first spiritual lesson that the Buddha imparted to his 7-year-old son? What should you learn first as a monk, as a novice? Anyone happen to know? There's this Rahula Sutta, right? The Buddha taught him to be more aware of the way he speaks, to be aware of the timing of his speech, the appropriateness, right? Whether or not it comes from a good place, meaning that it comes from like a undistorted intention, that he was not telling deliberate falsehood, right? Distorting what he perceived to be true, right? The Buddha taught him to observe the effect of his speech, whether or not the speech creates different effects in the audience and in yourself, right? So to give you an example, right now I'm talking, but I am also trying to kind of observe your facial expressions, with the exceptions of those who turn off their cameras. Right? I can kind of tell from your facial expression whether or not you're following, whether or not you're following, right? If someone like, I don't know, if Xiaojing started looking confused, I'm kidding, you don't look confused at all. Okay, but if you start looking confused, I'm going to maybe slow down. I'm going to inject maybe, I don't know, some um, stories or examples to better illustrate my point, right? Or maybe I'm seeing that, hey, someone is um, getting offended possibly by my unwitting remarks, right? So I should be a little more sensitive to how the message is being received, right? So this is called observing an effect in your audience. You also observe the effect in yourself. The way you speak has a direct impact on your overall mood, on your overall mindset. If you're a meditator, chances are you notice how certain speech makes you feel more courageous, makes you feel more anchored in reality, makes you feel more at ease. Other kinds of speech makes you feel wobbly inside, makes you feel bad about yourself, makes you feel shy and fearful and you wanting to go into a sort of evasive mode, right? So if you are in the habit of not distorting your speech, right, telling what you perceive to be true, as opposed to telling the deliberate falsehood, it has the effect of really building up your self-esteem, making you feel stronger, making you feel, more grounded, making you feel like, like the situation in your mind is not so chaotic, right? It's much more easily manageable, right? So speech has that effect. And the Buddha wants his students to be aware of what you are doing and also the effect of the doing. This is called karma, by the way. I know people usually understand karma as meaning, oh, if I donate flowers to temples in the next life, I'm going to look beautiful, right? If I say something bad about you and instantaneously, I don't know, a pigeon flies over me and, drops something on my head, that's karma, right? Actually, no. I understand how in later forms of Buddhism, karma has acquired different meanings, right? And there is kind of like a general shift in the focus of the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha was actually very critical of those religious teachers who claim to know all the permutations, all the ramifications of karma effects, right? To be able to say that, oh, if you, give this amount of money to this charity cause, then in the future life, you're going to, get this fixed, definite return, right? Yes, there's something to be said about doing skillful things and then getting skillful results. Yes. Okay. But to be able to pin it down, that's really the business of a ritualist. That's really the business of a religious Brahmin, right? That the Buddha was very critical of. So when the Buddha taught karma, he was primarily teaching how your action, your intention is the instrumental molder of your sense of well-being or the lack thereof, right? So why does the Buddha teach? Because our suffering has a karmic cause, therefore can be unraveled, can be undone. That's why. Okay, so focus on karma, meaning focus on what you're doing and its immediate and perhaps longer term effects. Okay. And for a lot of people, giving attention, being aware of activities is a very difficult thing. There's so many things happening. For example, there are a lot of fleeting and subtle thoughts, intentions, mental images, and so forth passing by, right? So you start out with something gross, something quite detectable, easily detectable, like your speech. Okay. And in addition to all the things you can um, observe your speech for, you could also look at, for example, how fast you are talking, how slowly, how leisurely you're talking. Right? There are people who suffer from, I don't know, stuttering, right? And there are behaviorists who will prescribe techniques such as, well, why don't you deliberately scramble your speech routine and speak in a speed that is completely unfamiliar to you, right? So in other words, the speed at which you speak also has an impact on your sense of who you are, sense of well-being, your mindset, and so forth. Okay. Now in this sutta, the Buddha was presuming that you've already passed beyond the first level of training. In other words, you're already a person of sufficient integrity. In other words, you're already a person who's sufficiently self-aware. What do I mean by sufficiently self-aware? Not only do you engage in at least some measure of self-examination or understanding of the effect of your activities, but you are also someone who, to use the Buddha's words, these are two very important qualities for a meditator, hiri, ottappa, right? Moral shame, fear, wrongdoing. I really don't like the translation, but bear with me. You're someone who is aware that your actions have consequences. And if you're heedless, if you're not careful about your actions, right, you may think this is relatively harmless. You don't care, right? You could afford to be heedless, right? You don't know what how one thing leads to another. You don't know the long-term implications. You don't know the long-term ramifications. You don't know how one careless intention lead to another, and before you know it, there's a snowball rolling down the hill, taking you to completely unexpected destiny. That's really the Buddha's general attitude towards karma. Let me try to unpack this just a little bit. So you look at someone like Hitler, right? Oh, like despicable human being. I'm never going to be like him, right? There's no chance I'm ever going to do something like what Hitler did, right? Then you don't really understand the nature of intention. The mind works in a tricky way. The mind can rationalize its behavior. And also the mind take one step at a time, and it goes down a slippery road, and it gradually, unawarely take you to a place that you initially deem to be unacceptable. When you get to the point, not only will you find that place acceptable, you find it perfectly familiar, comfortable, legitimate, normal, right? And this is how people end up in so-called hellish realm, in the three woeful states. We all think that we're not going there. But the Buddha said, basically teaches that if you're not careful with intention, you have no idea where it's taking you. Right now, from your present perspective, from the perspective of the present intention, you go, I'm not going to end up there, right? But this present intention is not you. It is a fleeting phenomenon. And the so-called intention, it comes from, they feel, they are tempered by, conditioned by so many other uncontrollable variables. Intention is really not self. It's really not you. Okay, so before you know it, you're going to end up in a very unexpected place. Okay, and this is why the Buddha said that everyone can practice to the point of becoming fully liberated with the following condition. You need to be in possession of these two mental qualities, hiri-ottappa. You need to be someone who is conscientious, right? Who is concerned about your long-term well-being. You're not someone who is just consumed by your present, I don't know, like impulse, right? I'm angry, so I'm gonna act out on my anger regardless of the consequences, right? I want immediate gratification, so I'm not going to worry about my long-term well-being. If you're someone like that, you're incapable of practicing meditation. Otherwise, once you fulfill that, I don't care how, you know, uneducated you think you are, or how non-intelligent you are, blah, 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 right? Meditation is widely accessible to people. Yeah. Okay, so coming back to steps 1 and 2. When the Buddha taught this, he was assuming that you already passed the first prerequisite, if you will. Right? You're someone in possession of those two qualities. You're someone who's already minimally watchful, alert, heedful of your actions and their effects. And now you are able to proceed to something a little more subtle, and that is the way you breathe, which is an activity, and its effect on your overall being. Now, the Buddha is not saying that shorter breath is better than longer breath. The Buddha is not saying that shallow breath is necessarily better than deeper breath. The Buddha is not saying necessarily that slower breath is better than hurried breath, even though there are some patterns you can say. You could say that when you're relaxed, when you're at peace, your breathing tend to be this way or that way, right? But there's no categorical relationship. The Buddha is not asking you to categorically manipulate your breath to be of a certain way. The Buddha is just telling you to be a little more watchful of how it affects your sense of being. And therefore, you can utilize the breath to moderate your sense of being at the present moment. Conversely, is it possible to breathe our way into anxiety? Yes. Yes, it's possible, right? If you're someone like me who used to suffer from panic attack, anxiety attack, right? What happens, at the first sign of anxiety attack coming on, right? The breath gets hijacked. Look at the breath and go, oh, no, something bad, something uncontrollable is going to happen to me. And they go into this catastrophic mode. And before you know it, this particular way of breathing takes you to an even scarier place, right? And you spiral out of control. You go into a vicious cycle, right? Alternatively, is it possible to breathe your way out of anxiety somewhat? Yes, it's possible. It's possible. Okay. So once again, steps 1 and 2, they are really about knowing what you're doing and the effect of your doing. And then it's kind of done in the background. What do I mean by that? When you look at the 16 steps, with the exceptions of steps 1 and 2, right? So I'm talking about steps 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way to 16. Every single one of these steps is prefaced with he trains in, meaning that that step is a formal technique. All right. The only 2 steps that do not have this premise are steps 1 and 2, meaning that these 2 are not formal techniques. These are kind of what sets up the tone, what sets up the practice. Okay. This is something quite ironic when you really think about it. The sutta that we're reading is called the Anapanasati Sutta. It's really a sutta on breathing, right? And yet, how important a role does breathing actually play in the sutta? Marginally, only in the first 2 steps. In all the other steps, right, breathing is not your main concern. Breathing kind of happens in the background. Breathing in, you glide in your mind. Breathing out, you glide in your mind. Breathing in, you're discerning impermanence. Breathing out, you're discerning impermanence. Breathing is kind of in the background. Breathing is not your main topic at all, with the exception of the first 2 steps. What makes this even more the case is you will be able to read the other suttas where almost the same steps were featured, but then the breath is not involved at all. Okay? So you'll be able to come across a sutta where the Buddha teaches the practitioner to become more sensitive to happiness and pleasure and to be watchful of mental sankharas and to calm them without involving the breath at all. Meaning that the breath is completely an optional element in this training. Okay, you could do any one of these steps with the exception 1 and 2 without involving the breath at all, without your giving attention to the breath at all. So as I was saying, the breath is just there to set up the tone, to set up the ambiance. Kind of like what? Kind of like, okay, I don't know, I'm studying. Let's say right now I'm studying for my final exam. And then at this local coffee shop that I study at, there's a nice classical music playing in the background. Okay. Now, do I hear the classical music? Yes, I do. But that's not my main concern. My main concern is what I'm studying. But the classical music is nice in the background. It kind of calms me down. It kind of like sets up a rhythm for the study, if you will. It kind of soothes the nervous system as you're studying. And steps 1 and 2 are kind of like that, right? So first you train in noticing how the rhythm of your breath, the relative depth, right? Shallowness, depth of your breath, moderate your sense of being. Kind of like in the background, there's music playing. People, I don't know, people are giving you a massage while you're studying, right? You're being soothed. But then your main occupation, your main preoccupation is with something else. Okay. Any questions, any comments before we end the class? So please be once again reminded. You don't have to write anything for this. If you want, you could write about, I guess, steps 1 and 2. We haven't really tried it, right? You could write about, you know, um, the theoretical aspect of meditation. Yeah. But otherwise, if there's not anything else, we could end here. Okay. All righty.
Professor, I know
Yes, please.
one
Go
last.
ahead.
I know you're gonna tell us next week, but should when we start journaling, should we journal every day? Is that the idea? Practice and
No,
write?
no.
No?
You turn in one
Got it.
journal. Yeah, and this journal
Okay.
is, half a page to a page. Like
Perfect. Okay.
yeah.
Thank you. Have a nice week.
See you guys. Bye bye.